There's a strange pattern in modern farming. A farmer buys a new planter, he runs the numbers. He upgrades equipment, he calculates depreciation. He adjusts nitrogen rates, he studies trials. But when it comes to tile drainage, he asks his neighbor. That's it. That's the entire decision-making process behind one of the largest capital investments on the farm. Tile drainage today costs anywhere from $1,000 to $1,500 per acre. On a 200-acre field, that's a $200,000 decision. On a 1,000-acre operation, you're suddenly committing over $1 million. And yet, most installations are still based on one simple sentence. Yeah, we tiled that field a few years back, worked great. No soil analysis, no drainage class evaluation, no ROI modeling. Just vibes. And here's the uncomfortable truth. For some farms, tile drainage is one of the best investments they will ever make. For others, it's a 20-year financial anchor that quietly drags down profitability every single season. And the worst part? Most farmers won't even realize it's happening. Because tile drainage doesn't fail loudly. It doesn't break down like a machine. It doesn't show up as a clear loss on a balance sheet. It fails silently. It shows up as slightly underwhelming yields, margins that never quite improve, capital that never quite pays back. And over time, that smart investment becomes something much harder to admit, a sunk cost. Let's break the illusion right now. Tile drainage is not about removing water. That's the marketing version. Tile drainage is about controlling timing. It's about getting into the field earlier, avoiding compaction during wet conditions, creating a stable root environment. That's where the yield gains come from. Not from drying the field, but from precision control of soil moisture over time. And this is where most farmers already go wrong. Because they think wet field equals needs tile. But soil doesn't work that way. Two fields can look equally wet in spring and have completely different drainage behaviors underground. One might justify a full tile system. The other might never pay it back. Now let's talk about the number everyone avoids. Return on investment. Because this is where the story gets uncomfortable. Let's say tile drainage increases your corn yield by 20 bushels per acre. Sounds great, right? At $5 corn, that's $100 per acre per year. Now subtract installation cost, amortization, interest on capital, maintenance over time. Suddenly, your great investment starts looking average. And that's in a best-case scenario, because yield response is not guaranteed. In fact, university data across the Midwest shows something most contractors will never tell you. Yield gains from tile drainage are highly dependent on soil type. Not field conditions, not rainfall, soil type, which means one brutal reality. Installing tile on the wrong soil is not a slow payback. It's a bad investment, and yet, it keeps happening. Every year, millions of dollars go into tile systems that were never economically justified. Why? Because tile drainage has become something more than a tool. It's become a default, a checkbox, this is what serious farmers do decision. And once something becomes cultural, people stop questioning it. In this video, we're going to do what most discussions about tile drainage avoid completely. We're going to break it down like a business decision. No opinions, no contractor sales pitch, no neighbor recommendations, just data. We'll cover which soils actually justify tile drainage, why spacing decisions can make or break ROI, what real yield data says versus industry claims, and how long it actually takes to break even at today's corn prices. Because if you're going to spend $1,200 per acre, you deserve to know if you're building an asset or installing a very expensive mistake. Now, before you even think about spacing, depth, or cost, you need to answer one question first. Does your soil even need tile at all? And this is where most projects already go off the rails. Before you install a single foot of tile, before you call a contractor, before you even open a spreadsheet, you need to answer one question. What kind of soil are you actually dealing with? Not what it looks like. Not what your neighbor says. Not what your yield map kind of suggests. Actual soil classification. Because here's the brutal reality. Tile drainage is not a universal upgrade. It is a precision tool designed for very specific conditions. And if those conditions aren't there, you're not optimizing your farm. You're bleeding capital. Let's break this into something practical. In the US, soils are typically classified into drainage categories: well-drained, moderately well-drained, somewhat poorly drained, very poorly drained. Now here's the part that should make you uncomfortable. Only the last two categories consistently justify tile drainage. Read that again: poorly drained and very poorly drained soils. That's where tile systems deliver reliable ROI. That's where water actually sits long enough to delay planting, suffocate roots, reduce yield potential. That's where drainage changes the game. But what do most farmers tile? Moderately well-drained ground. Why? Because it looks wet in the spring. Because it's a little slow to dry. Because someone said it could use tile. That's not analysis. That's expensive guesswork. Here's what happens in those borderline soils. Yes, tile drainage might improve field access by a few days. Yes, it might reduce some surface water. But the yield response? Inconsistent. Sometimes you gain 5 bushels. Sometimes 10. Sometimes nothing. And suddenly, your $1,200 per acre investment is producing returns that look more like a rounding error than a strategy. Let's get even more specific. Heavy clay soils? They hold water like a sponge with trust issues. These soils drain slowly, stay saturated longer, restrict root oxygen. This is where tile drainage shines. This is where tighter spacing, proper depth, and a well-designed system can unlock serious yield gains. Now compare that to loam soils. Balanced, stable, naturally draining. They might look wet on the surface, but below that, water is already moving. Install tile here, and you're often solving a problem that doesn't really exist. And then you have sandy soils. Fast drainage, low water retention. Installing tile here is like putting gutters on a desert. Technically possible, financially questionable. So why does this keep happening? Because most decisions skip the only step that actually matters: data. Real data, not yield maps alone, not visual inspection. We're talking soil surveys, drainage class maps, infiltration rates, water table behavior. And yet, most tile projects move forward without any of this. Now here's where things get interesting. Because even within the same field, you can have multiple soil types. One area might be poorly drained and justify tile. Another area? Completely fine. But what do most installations look like? Uniform, same spacing, same depth, same system across the entire field. Why? Because it's easier. Because it's faster. Because that's how it's always done. And just like that, you turn a precision investment into a blanket expense. You overinvest in areas that don't need it. You dilute your ROI across acres that will never pay you back. And you end up with a system that looks impressive, but performs average. Now let's talk about something people love to ignore: opportunity cost. That $1,200 per acre? It doesn't exist in isolation. That money could have gone into fertility improvements, better seed genetics, equipment upgrades, debt reduction. So the real question isn't, does tile drainage help? The real question is this the best place to put my capital right now? And that's a much harder conversation. Collision mid-video CTA, intentional, direct, no filter. If you're getting value from this, subscribe right now. Because most farming content will tell you what works. This channel shows you what actually pays. And those are not the same thing. Back to reality. If you skip soil analysis, if you rely on assumptions, if you treat tile drainage as a default upgrade, you're not making a calculated investment. You're placing a very expensive bet. Now let's assume you did everything right. You analyzed your soil. You confirmed drainage issues. You're ready to install tile. Great. Because this is where the next mistake happens. And it's the one that quietly destroys ROI. Spacing and system design. So, you did the rare thing. You checked your soil. You confirmed drainage issues. You decided tile actually makes sense. Congratulations. You're already ahead of half the industry. And yet, This is where a lot of good decisions quietly turn into mediocre outcomes. Because now we enter the part nobody wants to overthink: system design. More specifically, tile spacing. Let's simplify this. Tile spacing is not just a technical detail. It is the single biggest lever that determines whether your system maximizes yield, breaks even, or slowly drains your margins instead of your field. Here's the industry shortcut: 40 feet, 60 feet, 80 feet. Pick one, install, move on. Nice, clean, efficient. Also, wildly inaccurate, because spacing should never start with numbers. It should start with soil permeability, water movement rate, depth of restrictive layers, rainfall patterns. But that requires analysis. So instead, most projects default to standard spacing, which is basically the agricultural version of good enough, probably. Now let's talk about the trade-off nobody explains clearly. Tighter spacing equals higher cost plus higher performance. Wider spacing equals lower cost plus lower performance. Sounds obvious, but here's where it gets interesting. The relationship is not linear. Let's take heavy clay soil. Water moves slowly, very slowly. If you install tile at 80-foot spacing in this type of soil, water has to travel a long horizontal distance to reach the tile. But clay doesn't move water efficiently. So what happens? The soil stays saturated longer. Roots suffer. Yield gains get capped. And your expensive tile system underperforms. Now take the same soil, but install tile at 40-foot spacing. Suddenly, water has less distance to travel. Drainage becomes faster. Soil oxygen improves. Root development increases. And now, you actually unlock the yield potential you paid for. So what's the problem? Cost. Cutting spacing from 80 feet to 40 feet doesn't double your cost. It can increase it significantly depending on layout and materials. And this is where most decisions go sideways. Because farmers don't optimize for ROI. They optimize for initial cost comfort. They think, let's not overdo it. 60 or 80 feet should be fine. What they're really doing, installing a system that's too expensive to ignore, but not effective enough to maximize returns. That's the worst position to be in. Let's flip the scenario. Sandy or highly permeable soils. Water moves fast, very fast. Install tile at 40-foot spacing here, and you're over-engineering the system. You're paying for performance you don't need. Water would have drained just fine at wider spacing. So now your ROI takes a hit not because the system underperforms, but because it was oversized. Same mistake, different direction. Now here's something even more uncomfortable. Most contractors will not push back on your spacing choice. Why? Because tighter spacing equals more materials equals bigger project. Wider spacing equals faster install equals easier job. Either way, they get paid. So who's responsible for optimizing the system? You are, which is slightly terrifying if you think about how little data is usually involved. Let's talk about consistency, because this is another silent ROI killer. Most fields are not uniform. You might have clay pockets, loam transitions, low spots, slight elevation changes. But what do most systems look like? Perfectly uniform grid, same spacing across everything. That's not precision agriculture. That's convenience. And convenience is expensive. A properly designed system should adapt. Tighter spacing where soils are heavier. Wider spacing where drainage is naturally better. Yes, it's more complex. Yes, it requires mapping and planning. But this is a six-figure investment. Simple should not be the priority. Effective should. Now let's connect this back to ROI. Because that's the only metric that matters at the end of the day. If your spacing is too wide, you cap yield gains. You extend payback period. You reduce long-term profitability. If your spacing is too tight, you increase upfront cost unnecessarily. You lower return per dollar invested. There is a narrow window where spacing is optimized, and most systems miss it. And here's the kicker. Once tile is installed, you don't get a redo. This isn't adjusting nitrogen rates next season. This isn't switching hybrids. This is buried infrastructure. Permanent. So a bad spacing decision doesn't hurt once. It hurts every year. Quietly. consistently. Now let's assume you got it right. Right soil, right spacing, proper design, everything looks solid. Time to celebrate? Not yet, because now we hit the part everyone cares about, and almost nobody calculates correctly. The actual ROI. Not estimates, not assumptions, real numbers. And this is where things get very uncomfortable. Let's stop pretending. At the end of the day, tile drainage is not about agronomy. It's about capital allocation. You're not installing pipe, you're deploying money into the ground and hoping it comes back with interest. So let's run the numbers the way a business would. Start with the headline cost, $1,200 per acre. Some projects come in at $1,000. Others push $1,500. We'll stay in the middle. Now let's define a realistic scenario. Corn at $5 per bushel. Tile drainage yield response? Let's be generous. Plus 20 bushels per acre. That's the number most people like to quote when they're selling the idea. So, 20 bushels times $5 equals $100 per acre per year. Looks clean, looks simple, looks like a no-brainer. Except it's not, because that's gross revenue increase, not profit. Now subtract reality. First, cost of capital. Even if you paid cash, that money has a cost. At 6% interest, $1,200 per acre costs you about $72 per acre per year in opportunity cost. Now your $100 gain is down to $28. Second, maintenance and system longevity. Tile systems don't explode dramatically, but they don't live in a fantasy world either. Repairs, outlet issues, sediment buildup. Let's conservatively call it $5 to $10 per acre per year over time. Now you're at roughly $18 to $23 per acre. Third, variability. That 20 bushel increase? That's not every year. Some years, dry spring right pointing arrow little to no benefit. Ideal conditions right pointing arrow minimal difference. Wet year right pointing arrow big gain. Average that out over time and your real yield bump might be closer to 10 to 15 bushels. Let's say 12. Now your revenue becomes 12 times $5 equals $60 per acre. Run the same math again. $60 revenue, minus $72 capital cost, minus $8 maintenance. You're negative. Let that sit for a second. Now, does that mean tile drainage is a bad investment? No. It means most people evaluate it wrong. Because ROI in tile drainage is not just about yield. It's about risk reduction. And this is where things get nuanced. Tile doesn't just increase yield. It stabilizes it. It protects planting windows, root development, field accessibility. In wet years, that matters a lot. In dry years, not so much. So now your investment depends on something you don't control, weather distribution over time. And suddenly, your guaranteed return starts looking more like a probability curve. Now let's talk break even. At $1,200 per acre. Even in a decent scenario, you're looking at 10 to 20 years to break even. That's a long time, longer than most equipment cycles, longer than many land leases, and definitely longer than most people mentally account for when they say, yeah, tile pays. Now add one more layer. Commodity prices. If corn drops to $4, your entire ROI model shifts. If it drops to $3.50, some tile systems never pay back. Ever. But nobody installs tile thinking, hope corn stays high for 20 years. They install it assuming stability, which, historically, is a bold assumption. Now let's zoom out, because this is where the smartest operators think differently. They don't ask, does tile increase yield? They ask, is this the highest return per dollar I can get on this acre? Because that same $1,200 could go into variable rate fertility, soil structure improvement, hybrid optimization, drainage fixes in specific zones only. And sometimes, those outperform tile on a per dollar basis. That's the uncomfortable truth. Tile drainage is not always the best investment. It's just the most visible one. And visibility creates bias. You can see tile going in. You can't see better nutrient efficiency as easily. So guess which one feels more real? Now here's the part people don't like hearing. Some tile projects do pay back beautifully. High clay soils, consistent water issues, well-designed systems. Those can outperform almost anything else on the farm. But those are targeted decisions, not blanket installations. And that's the line most operations blur. They take a strategy that works in specific conditions and apply it everywhere. That's not scaling, that's dilution. So now we've gone through everything: soil, design, spacing, real ROI math. The final question is simple: should you install tile or not? Because the answer is not yes or no. It's something much more dangerous: it depends. And in the last part, we're going to make that answer painfully clear. So after everything we've covered: soil, spacing, design, real ROI math, we're left with the only question that actually matters: should you install tile drainage or not? And here's the answer most people hate: it depends. Not on opinion, not on tradition, not on what your neighbor did. It depends on whether the numbers and conditions align. Let's cut through the noise and make this brutally simple. Tile drainage makes sense when you have poorly drained or very poorly drained soils. Not kind of wet. Not slow in the spring. We're talking about land that consistently holds water, delays planting, limits root oxygen. Second, you're losing yield consistently, not occasionally. One wet year doesn't justify a $200,000 project. A pattern does. Third, you're designing the system properly. That means correct spacing for your soil, adjustments across field variability, real planning, not default settings. Because even the right decision becomes wrong with bad execution. Fourth, you understand the timeline. Tile is not a quick flip. It's a long-term capital play. If your operation can't absorb a 10 to 20-year horizon, this is not your move. Now let's flip it. Tile drainage does not make sense when your soil is already draining reasonably well. This is the biggest trap. Because visually wet does not mean functionally restricted. When your yield variability is driven by other factors: compaction, poor fertility management, hybrid mismatch, weather extremes unrelated to drainage, tile won't fix those. It will just sit underground, doing very little. When you're installing it just to be safe, that mindset destroys ROI. Because safety in farming is not about doing more, it's about doing what actually pays. And finally, when you haven't run the numbers, not rough estimates, not coffee shop math, actual projections. Because here's the uncomfortable truth that ties this entire video together. Most tile drainage projects are not bad because tile doesn't work. They're bad because they were never evaluated as investments. They were installed as habits, as traditions, as assumptions. And assumptions are expensive. Now zoom out for a second. The best operators in agriculture today are not the ones using the most technology. They're not the ones installing the most systems. They're not the ones spending the most money. They're the ones allocating capital better than everyone else. Every dollar has a job. Every investment has a timeline. Every decision competes against alternatives. That's the real game. Tile drainage? It's just one option on the table. A powerful one, but also a dangerous one if used blindly. So before you spend $1,200 per acre, before you commit six figures to something you can't undo, ask yourself one question: am I solving a proven problem, or buying into a default solution? Because one builds long-term profit, the other builds very expensive regret. And the difference between those two is not the technology, it's the decision behind it. If you want more breakdowns like this, where we stop looking at what sounds good and start focusing on what actually makes money, subscribe. Because modern farming doesn't reward effort anymore. It rewards precision.